Hello everyone. If I could just welcome you to the first breakout session that we have today. I'm Steve Edwards, the head of the Health Technology Assessment Group with the BMJ Evidence Centre, and I'll be chairing today's session. We've got two quite different presentations today. The first one on effective disinvestment using evidence will be given by Dr. Dyfrig Hughes, who's currently Deputy Director of the Centre for Economics and Policy in Health at Bangor University, as well as being a member of the National Institute of Health Research HTA Pharmaceutical Panel. Our second presentation on change management will be given by Professor Tony Rudd, who's consultant at St Thomas's Hospital. He's the Stroke Clinical Director for London and has chaired the NICE Stroke Quality Standards Development Group and the NICE Guidelines Development Group for Acute Stroke and Transient Ischemic Attack. We'll be having presentations followed by a short period of questions, and I'll now hand over to Dr. Hughes.
Thank you very much and good morning. My presentation this morning is about disinvestment. We've heard much in the news about new drugs which are extremely expensive, but the incremental increase in health benefits might not be that great to justify the cost. And so what normally happens is that there needs to be some way of finding resources to pay for these new and costly interventions, and one particular way that we're looking towards is in disinvesting in current practice. And this is more so important in the current economic climate, where the NHS will need to achieve unprecedented efficiency gains to meet the current financial challenge and future costs. These quotes are taken from the Department of Health documents on equity and excellence, that the NHS will need to release up to about £20 billion of efficiency savings by 2014, with this funds being reinvested to support improvements in quality and outcomes. We heard recently from the Economic Review that the funds for the NHS is effectively ring-fenced, but in real terms it means only a 0.4% increase per year over the next 4 years. And so there is a real need to try and operate in a more efficient manner, and disinvestment is central to that. The NHS Confederation recently published a report on commissioning in a cold climate, and where they state that PCTs need to identify opportunities to decommission infrastructure, which include both staff and capital costs and so on, as part of an agreed strategy to cease or shift service provision. So it's becoming more explicit that there needs to be some element of cuts, efficiency savings, however you might want to call it, in order to fund new technologies, typically, which are increasingly more expensive. National Institute of Clinical Excellence, which announced yesterday, or the Department of Health rather, announced that there will be a shift in their focus in the coming years. They have looked into disinvestment, and they have an important role to play here in terms of offering products and services to help organisations meet the twin challenges of providing high quality care to patients and the public, while also saving money and resources. And they claim that the guidances and the technology appraisals that they've issued, if implemented as predicted by the appraisal teams, would save around about £600 million annually through reduced use of ineffective interventions and promoting the use of more efficient interventions. Going back to the Department of Health document on equity and excellence, the QIP, Quality, Innovation, Productivity and Prevention Initiative, is also in the process of identifying how efficiencies can be driven and services redesigned to achieve improved quality and efficiency. So it's a recurring theme from different components and different aspects of the NHS, where there's a real need for efficiency, implementing efficient strategies in the delivery of healthcare. So that leads me to the formal definition of disinvestment and how it links in with the concept of opportunity cost. Disinvestment essentially is the consumption, realization or reduction of investment or a diminution of capital goods. So in other words, it's a withdrawal of service to release funds that can be used in a more efficient manner. And linked closely to that is the concept which health economists are very fond of, and that is of opportunity cost, which essentially puts is that the loss of opportunity cost is the loss of other alternatives when one alternative is chosen. So investing £100,000 in one particular area means that there's £100,000 no longer available to be used in another. And these two are clearly interlinked. If you invest in a new treatment which is arguably more effective but considerably more expensive, then within a system of fixed budget you need to disinvest from another area in order to be able to fund the new therapy. So NICE have touched upon disinvestment. I mentioned earlier the report they had about the potential for saving £600 million per year. But one thing they don't do is to explicitly appraise health technologies which are deemed to be ineffective or inefficient. They focus more so on new therapies and new health technologies which are arguably a little bit more effective but are typically considerably more expensive. And the consequence of NICE decisions is that the NHS in England and Wales is legally obliged to fund treatments that are recommended by NICE's technology appraisal committees. But clearly NICE doesn't receive any extra money to support its recommendations. And so on a local PCT type level, there needs to be some mechanism to try and identify funds in order to pay for these new technologies that NICE recommend. And that's my second bullet point here, is that the funding of new expensive interventions relies on releasing funds by displacing other treatments. But the problem is that NICE doesn't specify how these savings are to be made. Okay, so it'll specify which areas to invest in new treatments, but it doesn't specify which areas to disinvest in order to fund them. And the potential consequence of that is that a lack of direction by NICE on candidates for disinvestment will lead to the same geographical variation that NICE was established to reduce. So if you have if you have decisions in different regions of the country on which technologies and services and programs to disinvest, and those decisions are not consistent, then clearly there's going to be differences in care, and the geographical variation is almost a negative postcode prescribing, which NICE was established to reduce back in 1999. There have been several reports, one by the National Audit Office on prescribing in primary care. I'm going to focus the remainder of the talk on medicines and ways in which we could potentially reduce costs in medicines. The NHS in England spent about £12 billion on medicines in 2009, and clearly there is much scope to reduce the drugs bill, and there are several ways which might help achieve that aim. And one would be for better prescribing, if I can call it that. And the National Audit Office report suggested that £200 million could be saved if all PCTs in England used a number of medicines in the same way or at the same standard as the 25% most efficient PCTs. So that's a suggestive of variation in practice across PCTs, and if the least efficient PCTs were to perform somewhat better, then there's a potential there for a saving of £200 million annually. So how might we identify medical interventions which might be appropriate candidates for disinvestment? Well, there are many signals that might point towards something not being effective and not being sufficiently efficient to warrant healthcare expenditure. And it might be triggered by new evidence. And the conference clearly is very much driven by evidence, so that fits in neatly with evidence of things not working as much as evidence of things working well. And so if there is a suggestion of a health technology or a medicine being ineffective, then clearly that's an obvious candidate for investment. Or equally, if there is a new medicine for the same indication which is more effective, then the older medicine would be a suitable candidate potentially for disinvestment. Safety, we hear about new drugs and existing old drugs where there are safety concerns that are only evident over time, and clearly any new safety problem, then it's a potential candidate for disinvestment. We saw coproximal not so long ago being withdrawn by the regulators, the MHRA, and there were several £1 million spent on coproximal, which was not much more effective than existing analgesia, though it did have the potential safety hazards in terms of suicides and so on and so forth. If there is any new evidence on cost effectiveness, so for instance if a generic alternative became available, then it seems reasonable enough not to promote the use of the branded product. And so many of these points are common sense, but the challenge is in implementing a case for disinvestment once there is a suggestion that there might be a potential medicine or a candidate, a medicine that is candidate for disinvestment. Another form of signal might be variation in care, and there are several studies that assess variation in prescribing practice across England and the remainder of the UK, and clearly where there are discrepancies in use, then that might be a signal as to potential that in some localities they might be using something that's more effective than in others. So when there is variation in practice, then that could be a signal for something which is less effective or at least less efficient. There's increasing use or rather increasing concern about drugs used outside their license indication. And there have been recent reports on the cost of specials, so drugs manufactured without a product license, and their costs are quite astronomical. So omeprazole, for instance, formulated as a liquid, as opposed to the capsules, can cost up to about £800, compared with pennies for the capsules. Other signals for candidates for disinvestment include some technological development. So perhaps there's a new therapy which has a change in formulation. So it might be something that's given once a day as opposed to twice a day, and with claims that it is more effective and promotes patient adherence and so on. But in actual fact, it might cost several-fold greater than the existing therapy, which is twice-a-day formulation. And so do you invest in the new, or do you disinvest in the old? And there's a balance to be made there. Is the new agent or the new formulation, is it more effective? Is it more cost-effective? Or is the older preparation good enough? Okay, so there are clearly issues here in terms of interpreting the evidence and making a decision for the inclusion of a particular drug in the formulary. And the final point I've listed here, this is taken from an excellent overview of the issue in the Medical Journal of Australia, and clearly consultation with special interest groups and guideline development groups of NICE, for instance, involve a range of experts who make decisions as to the most effective, most cost-effective, and likewise services and interventions that shouldn't be used because they're ineffective or not cost-effective. So we recently published an article in the BMJ about how new drugs might displace old and whether that's appropriate or not. And we went through some case studies where the potential for investing in new could be worthwhile or appropriate use of healthcare funds, but also several examples whereby the existing therapy was actually preferred to the new on the basis that the increase in cost just simply isn't justified by any evidence of benefit. Recently also produced a review comparing branded and generic medicines, and not so long ago, only last year, the PPRS, the Pharmaceutical Price regulation scheme proposed that the Department of Health will introduce generic substitution in primary care. So in other words, doctors writing prescriptions for a branded product could be presented to the pharmacist. The pharmacist in turn would be able to dispense the generic equivalent. And that would have a predicted saving of several tens of million, because although generic prescribing is very high, 80-odd%, there is still room for further generic prescribing and reduction in branded prescribing. And that was the Department of Health stance, that they would introduce automatic substitution by pharmacists in primary care. So we looked at the evidence on equivalence between branded and generic medicines, and there have been a couple of reviews published in reputable journals. This one from JAMA compares branded versus generic drugs for cardiovascular diseases, and included there a range of drug classes, beta blockers, diuretics, calcium channel blockers, and so on and so forth, and identified studies for each of these, ranging from single studies to 10 studies in the case of diuretics. Calculated the effect size from each individual trial and pooled the results in a meta-analysis. And you see the overall estimate doesn't favour neither the branded nor the generic equivalent. So the clinical evidence, as you might expect, suggests equivalence in health outcomes when comparing generic versus branded medicines. Now, given that the cost of branded can be as much as 3, 4, 5 times the cost of generic, it would clearly make sense to prescribe the generic when one is available. A more contentious area might be to do with drugs for epilepsy, and there have been several articles suggesting that change from branded to generic might upset the treatment of epilepsy and induce seizures. But there was a recent review published earlier this year, smaller studies in this case, but nevertheless none of the studies individually showed any favour for the generic versus the branded when it came to assessing uncontrolled seizures after a switch. And the overall pooled estimate at the top of this figure shows an odds ratio of 1 and the 95% confidence intervals either side of 1. So again, even in an area where there has been debate on the appropriateness of generic switching, the evidence suggests that there isn't much difference, if any, when using a far cheaper generic compared with a more expensive branded product. Only a couple of weeks ago, the government responded to the original proposal of last year, and they decided not to progress with plans for the generic substitution of medicines in primary care. So a bit of a U-turn there, but clearly we've had a new government in the meantime. And the reasons that they gave were quite weak, but they said that national plans to enforce generic substitution in primary care are too prescriptive. So in other words, they wanted GPs to have their own, to make up their own minds as to what they wanted to prescribe. And that's the way clearly the NHS in England is moving, as we've heard in announcements in recent times. So that's a missed opportunity in a way. There was a good case there for several tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds of savings through the use of generic versus branded, but clearly it wasn't in the government's interest. The second category I want to refer to are Me Too products, and typically you would have a first-in-class product followed by another one which is about the same but perhaps a slightly different, a slightly different molecular structure, followed by another one in a year to come, and that will have a slightly modified structure. And we see for each class of therapy there might be half a dozen or more different drugs. And typically the Me Too products, as they're referred to, cost slightly more, much more in some instances, each time a product is made available. And so there have been schemes such as prescribing incentive schemes for payment to be made to GPs to switch to equally effective but cheaper medicines through a financial reward system. And the Department of Health not so long ago advised on the use of standard operating procedures, and they gave case examples of incentives in the field of statins, where clearly generic simvastatin is far cheaper than branded atorvastatin. And so the issue of switching from a more expensive me-too to a generic, usually first-in-class, is something that was promoted by the Department of Health. Unsurprisingly, the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry mounted a legal challenge against this. And quite recently, the European Court of Justice looked at the case and ruled in favour of national public health authorities who have the responsibility of controlling public expenditure. So there was nothing illegal about therapeutic switching and prescribing incentive schemes. So that's some good news. So I'll go through the evidence in relation to statins. Statins cost the NHS in England about £450 million last year. That's just in the community, so if you can round it up to at least £500 million. So it's quite substantial. And a fair proportion of that, £75 million, is spent on branded products. And you might question the relevance of that and the appropriateness of that. But again, there's heavy marketing. There are some instances perhaps where patients might not tolerate simvastatin, and so it might be appropriate to switch to another statin, and so on and so forth. So that might capture and reflect that. And again, to add to the issue here is that there is a real lack of randomized controlled trials of switching from one statin to the other. So it's difficult to tell really whether switching actually works and whether changes in cholesterol and cardiovascular events are equivalent, if not better, from switching from one statin to the other. And this table is taken from a review a few years ago from the BMJ, which compared the various statins. And I've rejigged the table somewhat to group them according to the reduction in LDL cholesterol along the top row. So we can see that the most commonly used dose is the 40 milligrams of simvastatin, which comes in at £1.40 for 28 days. And that gives you about 37–38% reduction in LDL cholesterol. And when you compare that with atorvastatin, which is used, I mean, it's not used widely, but it's most certainly used, it's 10 times more expensive for the same reduction in cholesterol. And rosuvastatin, a newer statin, another me-too, is even more expensive at £18. Now clearly, the trial evidence supporting these will be different. Some will be based on the surrogate endpoints of LDL cholesterol. Others might have harder cardiovascular outcomes, but nevertheless, the differences in costs are quite substantial between the older first-in-class, which now are available as generic, versus the newer ones, the me-toos, which are clearly far more expensive. The next category of pharmaceuticals I'll be looking into are what's called the Evergreened products. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this concept, but a variety of legal and business strategies by which pharmaceutical industries with patents over products that are about to expire maintain market share by either taking out new patents or by buying out or frustrating competitors. That's the definition of evergreening. So in other words, a company might have a patent on a medicine, and with a year to go on that patent, they modify it ever so slightly, and then they get a new patent on that product for another 5, 6, 7 years. So they can switch people in the meantime, or try and persuade GPs perhaps to switch patients from their existing treatment, which is soon to come off patent, to their new product, which has clearly a price premium to it. And there was a report presented to the House of Lords not so long ago whereby they looked at 6 commonly used medicines where evergreening strategies had been applied, and the suggestion was that it resulted in little or no therapeutic gain to patients, but cost the NHS between 160 and £370 million. It's quite substantial costs. And I'll go through some of the examples, one of which is when you look at the enantiomeric form of drugs, and many drugs come left and right-handedness, and omeprazole is one such example. That omeprazole is a racemic mixture of R and S-omeprazole. And 2 years before the expiry of the patent for omeprazole, the manufacturers, AstraZeneca I think, were granted market authorization for Esomeprazole. So they isolated the S enantiomer. And last year the NHS in England spent £42 million on Esomeprazole in the community. And globally it's actually the third highest selling drug. It's quite unbelievable in actual fact when you look at the trial evidence. There have been no trials to demonstrate the therapeutic advantage of esomeprazole over other proton pump inhibitors when treatments are given at equivalent doses. So why use the newer agents when an existing therapy is equally as effective, particularly when you consider the cost? 1 month of omeprazole is £1.80, whereas 1 month of esomeprazole is almost exactly 10 times more expensive. So that, you could argue, that's £42 million that was almost entirely wasted. Second example of evergreening is to change the formulation. And there's several examples here, but the one I've picked up on here is sumatriptan, used for migraine. And the manufacturers introduced a new film-coated dispersible formulation 2 years before the patent expired on their initial Imigran formulation. There's no proven additional clinical benefits, but it costs 14 times more than the generic sumatriptan. Okay. A third example is to reformulate so that it becomes modified release. So quetiapine, which is very widely used, its patent will expire quite soon. And the manufacturers introduced an extended release formulation of quetiapine just before the patent had expired, but they had no evidence of improved adherence or of improved clinical performance. All the trials were non-inferiority. There were no demonstration of superiority. There was no demonstration of improved patient adherence. But the cost, clearly, well, we don't know because the generic quetiapine isn't yet out, but I'm sure it'll be much, much lower than the extended release. A fourth example is a change now in route of administration, and an example we're all familiar with here is transdermal GTN, which are far more likely to induce nitrate tolerance, and they cost substantially more than sublingual nitrate preparations. Other examples include combination products. So when a patent is about to expire on a single product, the manufacturers produce a co-formulated product including some other chemical within it. And this is an example of alendronate plus vitamin D, which costs far more than either generic alendronate plus calcium and vitamin D taken separately. And you might argue, well, it might improve patient adherence. Well, it might well do, but you still have to take calcium because that's not part of the formulation, so you still end up taking 2 tablets instead of 3. An example where the company, this is loratadine, antihistamine for hay fever and other allergic type conditions, they isolated the active metabolite of loratadine, which is desloratadine. And the patent on loratadine expired, and hey presto, the cost of desloratadine is 5 times greater than the generic loratadine. So there's no real evidence of anything better in terms of clinical performance, but clearly it's very cost-ineffective use of resources. This is an example of whereby they produced a new drug, not formulation, a different salt, or a small subtle change to the molecule. So perindopril arginine, for instance, was introduced when the patent of the perindopril butamine was to expire, but it confers no additional benefit and is 3 times more expensive. It's just a different salt. So when it's ingested, the parent molecule and the salts, they dissociate in any case, so it makes no odds. And the final category I have is to do with physicochemical characteristics of drugs. And siroxat, paroxetine hydrochloride hemihydrate. So now the drug is paroxetine, the salt is hydrochloride, and hemihydrate is the form of the crystals. So this is, in some ways, it's sort of semi-hydrated crystalline form. And that has absolutely no clinical advantage over the anhydrous form, which is the generic equivalent, but it is 4 times more costly. So I've gone through a range of examples there of a process called Evergreening, which is a strategy that pharmaceutical manufacturers employ to try and artificially extend their patent period. But in the meantime, as the originator products become available as generic forms, they clearly, the newer varieties are not cost effective in most instances. So I'll go back now to looking at some ways whereby locally we could potentially look at some systematic approach to disinvestment. And the key issue here is to try and link investment in something which is new and arguably something which is better, with disinvestment in something which is ineffective or at least inefficient. And one such technique that's been around for several years but not particularly widely implemented is program budgeting and marginal analysis, PBMA. And a PBMA exercise addresses priorities from the perspective of resources. And it asks a series of questions. First of all, the 2 first ones are in relation to the program budgeting. So the first question to ask is what resources are available in total. So you need to know the starting point of how much you have to spend on new therapies or services or healthcare programs, and to identify the ways that these resources are currently being spent. So that's the PB component of PBMA. The second component is the marginal analysis, and what we're trying to do here is to look at the newer agents first of all, so to list effectively the main candidates for more resources and what would be their effectiveness and cost. So identifying which areas to expand. But to go hand in hand with that, and this is what NICE isn't doing, NICE effectively draw the line there, but locally we could arguably look also to see which aspects to disinvest. And there are 2 forms of disinvestment. One is when you try to achieve technical efficiency. So in other words, you disinvest in the same area as where you're investing. So there might be some treatments for diabetes and you withdraw one service for patients with diabetes, but you introduce another. So you're not really affecting other groups other than patients with diabetes. And that's what the 4th bullet point refers to here. The alternative component of disinvestment, of marginal analysis, is to look at areas outside the immediate therapeutic area. So now we're more interested in allocative efficiency. So we might reduce services in diabetes in order to fund more services in dementia care. Okay. And when these are all looked together in a systematic way, it provides a more cohesive framework in order to link the investment with the issue of disinvestment. And just to summarise this, I did lift this from BMJ from not so long ago, and it talks about NHS treatments, and there's a finite amount of funding to go around, so anything that you do invest in, it goes hand in hand with having to disinvest in something else. Thank you.
So now if we could open the floor for some questions.
Rich Sates from Boston. Thank you. Rich Sates from Boston. Thank you. It was a terrific talk. One thing I wanted to ask you about is if you've seen evidence about what happens with switching beyond just the cost of the drug. So as a primary care physician, I'll often get a notice from an insurer that says we're switching your patients or your individual patient from atorvastatin to simvastatin. And then the next thing I need to do, if I don't disagree, because these things are done with my consent, but at their suggestion. If the next thing that I need to do is bring the patient in for a visit, discuss it, check liver enzymes, then I wonder whether they're going to be adherent on the new medication, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a number of costs and potential effects that go beyond the drug. One other just quick thing I wanted to mention is that at least in Massachusetts, and I think in the rest of the U.S., if I prescribe a branded drug, the pharmacist automatically substitutes a generic unless I specifically write do not substitute. So that is something that's in place. But additional costs.
Yeah, no, it's two fair points there. The first one is there is a lack of evidence on switching. Many of the estimates I provided on the statins, for instance, were drawn from trials where they weren't switching. They were simply just looking for LDL cholesterol reduction, going with one agent. And so there is an issue about that, and monitoring of patients during that change process is clearly an important clinical aspect. In terms of your second point, I've no doubt that in other countries the issue of generic substitution is used and is a practice that's widely used. But in the UK, clearly it isn't, and it was a reversal of the decision of the Department of Health here that didn't make that possible.
Hello. I think I'm sort of glad that the Department of Health decided not to go with that, because it is a very, very blunt tool. For example, currently we've been informed, I work in London as a GP, that at the moment the Ventolin MDIs are actually cheaper than the generic salbutamol. So we're all being encouraged to actually prescribe Ventolin rather than salbutamol, which goes against what we've been trying to do for the last 20 years. But there are a number of things which would make it a lot easier for GPs. I don't know what the gentleman there said, he gets feedback from the insurers. We could get feedback it would be very helpful in our prescribing if we had feedback on two levels. One is when we actually go to do the prescription on the computer, if the price information was accurate and up to date, and even better, if the cheapest one came top of the list so we didn't have to scroll down. And secondly, if we could get at least practice level prescribing data back in a timely fashion, because if we don't know that we're out of line with everybody else, we're not going to be encouraged to move.
Yeah, I think they're good points. I think that there's a real issue of IT here, isn't there, really, that would facilitate many of the points that you've raised. One interesting observation is that atorvastatin's patent, the European patent, will expire in about a year or two's time. So then when the generic atorvastatin comes out, will everybody be switched to that from the generic simvastatin, I wonder? So there are a whole load of issues here, and as you rightly point out with the Ventolin, it is actually cheaper than the generic. So there are lots of oddities that would need to be ironed out had something like this been implemented.
Hi, Christine Bennett from Bupa, Australia. I had two questions. One related to the 25% of PCTs that were most efficient. I was just wondering if you could explain what most efficient meant, because sometimes that translates into uses the least, which may or may not be most efficient. And the second thing was the payment, the financial rewards for Me Too drugs. I don't really understand why that's more problematic or less problematic than the generics. In Australia, what we do is the doctor has a little box which is as a brand substitution not permitted. Unless they tick that box, then it is permitted. So there is a clinical opportunity to say no, not permitted. But there's an automatic generic substitution unless that box is ticked. So I mean, given that you've got financial rewards for Me Too drugs, I would have thought it would be acceptable.
Yes, I mean, the simple things such as including a box on the prescription or introducing some IT infrastructure would certainly facilitate appropriate generic substitution. And there has been, going back to the 1980s, generic prescribing was at 35%. So it's increased from 35% then to 80+% today. And that has been through education, really, and a lot of intervention through lead prescribers and pharmaceutical advisors and so on and so forth. So there has been a cultural shift, and you have to also question whether there's any real benefits of going the extra 1 or 2 percentage points when you're already sort of maxed out at the 80+%. So there's a lot of issues there, and appropriate generic substitution could have been something that the government might have considered in a bit more detail. About the 25% most efficient, I believe, I'm not overly familiar with the data that they presented, but I believe they did control for local needs and local population demographics in their calculations, but it was to do with prescribing rates controlled for these other variables.
The gentleman in the middle.
The temptation at the moment is that responsibility is being given to the physician alone in the UK, and that's from NICE's recent decision about cancer drugs, but also in some of these areas, say desloratadine, the patient is absolutely certain that their desloratadine is more effective than the loratadine we tried to give them earlier. And it strikes me that because of a political responsibility and answerability to an electorate which is whimsical and variable, there's reluctance to take responsibility at national level for some of these issues. And there's a feeling that there's a game called Pass the Bomb going on, and that's coming into GP commissioning, where instead of wanting to take responsibility at a national, apparently we have a national health service here, at a national level, that the bomb is to be passed to the individual physician, and they have to have the punch up with the patient over whether it's cancer drugs or desloratadine. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I mean, I think that's all to do with the reconfiguration of the health service that we've heard announcements of in the last few days and weeks, and moving responsibilities back to the GPs. You know, it's where things were in the 80s and 90s, and has it gone a full circle? Are we going backwards, or is it something else progressive? I don't know. You know, that's a whole PhD thesis plus in its own right.
Why do I want the bomb?
I know, precisely. I mean, what I've argued, specifically in relation to prescribing, there is in the BNF, for many products, there is a small box with NHS written within it and a line struck right through that box, and that's for medicines which are blacklisted, not prescribable on the NHS. And that list hasn't been updated since 2004. And I really can't see the reason for that, because desloratadine surely is a candidate to be placed for something in the blacklist as something that shouldn't be prescribed in the NHS, and that would be at the national level and reduce the pressure on GPs and people locally.
My name's Annabelle, Bupa UK. I've got 2 questions about where the biggest opportunity is. Your talk focused on drugs. Is there also an opportunity around compliance, even if we focus on getting the best cost or value drugs? What about compliance? And the second question is, how big are the opportunities around drugs compared to devices, surgery, increasing techniques such as robotic surgery, which we're beginning to see more of?
Yeah, okay. Well, in terms of adherence or compliance, it happens to be a pet interest of mine. There have been several studies that have repeatedly shown how poor adherence is in practice. And so, for instance, I'll give you 2 examples taken from GPRD, which is a database of general practice prescribing and other variables and parameters across the UK, whereby the median persistence for patients being initiated with antihypertensives is 3 years. So half of patients completely give up their treatments after 3 years. Now that, for something which is chronic and supposedly lifelong, is quite an eye-opener. The second example is a very similar type of study, and this is of tamoxifen for patients with breast cancer. And you'd expect perhaps persistence would be longer. Now, controlling for survival and so on and so forth, the median persistence was 5 years in that instance. And again, they concluded that it should have been far longer than the figures suggested. And these types of figures are repeated. There's several studies of patients not being adherent to cardiovascular medicines and subsequent hospitalizations because of heart failure, for instance. And so there is much to be done in improving patient adherence, which is woefully low at the moment. And there was a nice guidance on adherence to medicines published a year ago. And I don't know whether that's been assessed and how effective it will turn out to be. But there's far more scope to try and improve patients' adherence to medications.
Well, if we can take...
Your second point, very briefly, you talk about other health technologies, and you're quite right. They are equally as expensive, and in more cases than not, there's even less evidence of the effectiveness of surgical interventions, for instance.
Well, if we can just take one question from the middle there, from the lady in the middle, and then one final one from the front.
Nikki Whittaker from France. I've been out of the NHS for 15 years, so I may be out of date on this one. But an obvious candidate for disinvestment would be, due to lack of effectiveness, would be homeopathic medicines. And it's, I assume the Royal Homeopathic Hospital still exists, and I assume also that this must be some political reason for it. I just wondered if you could enlighten me on why the NHS is still spending money on it.
Well, my personal belief, I think it should be illegal. I know that, again, I think the governments have made a U-turn on this, that there was a report suggesting that NHS should no longer be funding any homeopathic therapies, and they, a few weeks ago, announced that now they would continue funding them. Now, it's only a few £1 million, but nevertheless, it all adds up, and the evidence certainly does not recommend or does not suggest that homeopathic medicines are any better than placebos.
What is the role of defensive medicine in in driving up costs in Britain, and is that likely to change?
A good question. I'm probably the wrong person to ask. I really don't know the answer to that one, to be quite honest with you.
Well, we can now thank Dr. Hughes, please, and hand over to Professor Rock.